Hey guys, welcome back to day 2 of our discussion of the plant kingdom. If you remember yesterday, the last video, we left off talking about the two types of vascular plants that we have. Vascular plants are the plants that contain the vascular tissue to transport food and water throughout the plants, and that enables these plants to grow taller and larger than our non-vascular plants. Well, there are two types of vascular plants that we were looking at, and that is those with seeds and then those without seeds, okay? Those without seeds are not as common and they're not as numerous as the types of vascular plants that have seeds. So today we're going to take a look at the two types of seed plants. So these are vascular plants that produce seeds. These are separated or classified based upon their reproductive structures, and they reproduce by either cones or flowers. So those big trees that produce the cones, that's a type of seeded vascular plant, and then your basic average flowers or flowering plants, flowering bushes, flowering trees, those are also a type of vascular plant with seeds. The cones or the flowers is what contains the pollen, which is the sperm cell, and the egg for these plants. The first of the two is called the gymnosperms, and the gymnosperms are cone bearers. So these are your cone-bearing plants, which would be your Christmas trees and all different types of fir trees as such. These are the oldest form of land plant, so these were the first type of vascular plant that evolved, okay, way back many, many moons ago. And their reproduction, of course, is cones. So their gametophyte stage is their cones, and inside the cones they produce the sperm and the egg. Now, believe it or not, there is a difference between the male cones, which produce the pollen, the sperm, and the female cones, which produce the egg. Of course, the fusion of the sperm and the egg creates the zygote, which we then know to be the seed. The sporophyte stage is, of course, the trees. So the seed actually is the beginning of the sporophyte stage, and then the sporophyte actually is the tree that you're looking at. Okay? Many of these seeds have what are called wings that aid in the dispersal. It makes it easier for the wind to pick them up and carry them away. And in the next slide, you're going to see a diagram of the life cycle of gymnosperms. And hopefully then you can see the wings that we have on the seeds. Okay? Now then, of course, when conditions are favorable and the seeds fall on favorable ground, the seeds will grow into trees through the process of germination, which is no different than the seeds of the other type of seeded vascular plant. And germination is germination. The roots go down and the shoot comes up. It's the same for all plants. Now, here's the diagram of the life cycle of your average gymnosperm. And you can see where I said there is a difference between the male cones and the female cones of these plants. The male cones, the ones that produce the pollen or the sperm cells, tend to be thinner and closed, whereas the female cones that produce the eggs inside, those tend to be wider or larger, and they tend to be more open. And of course, the scales of the cone are open in order for pollen to fall in, to be able to get in and fertilize the seed. And then when that happens, that enough pollen goes in and fertilizes the seeds, or the eggs, inside these cones, you can see the female cone starts to open up completely and starts to fall apart. And as it's falling apart, these seeds, and hopefully you can see in the lower right-hand side of that diagram, which are winged, they fall out and the wind picks them up and carries them very easily because of that winged structure. And again, if they fall on ground that's favorable for growth, they grow into the young sporophyte, which then continues to develop into the adult sporophyte, which are those large fir trees that you see. The second type of seeded vascular plant is the angiosperms. And angiosperms is a word that means covered seeds. Okay, for the gymnosperms, they're cones. Those seeds are open. All right, here in the angiosperms, these are covered seeds. Okay? Angiosperms are the flowering plants. Any plant that produces flowers is considered to be an angiosperm. Now, there are certain types of trees that produce flowers, and they produce fruits as a result of that. They are angiosperms. So, not all trees are gymnosperms. A lot of trees are angiosperms. Vegetable plants are angiosperms. Any type of a plant that produces a flower is an angiosperm. Of course, this is the most common type of land plant, and the smells, the shapes, and the colors of the flowers aid in transferring the gametes for fertilization. Okay, the smell, the shapes, the colors of the flowers attract insects, birds, and small animals that will carry pollen from flower to flower for fertilization to produce more seeds, to produce more plants. I'm sure if you've seen bees, flying from flower to flower, they're unconsciously pollinating flowers. When they land on the flower to suck out the nectar, the pollen gets on their legs, and then when they fly to the next flower, some of that pollen actually falls off and gets deposited inside that flower, and fertilization occurs. Birds and small animals will often get the pollen stuck to their feathers or to their fur as they're brushing up against these flowers. And then again, the pollen falls off, and if it lands on other flowers, pollination takes place. Okay? The seeds of angiosperms are enclosed inside fruits, and the fruits protect them and also aid in dispersal. Animals eat the fruits, and most animals, not humans, but most animals do not chew the seeds. They just digest them, or they just swallow them whole, and so they don't really get digested. So they kind of come out the same way that they go in, which I talked about this in the previous video. When those seeds land on ground, they already have their own manure with them, and if it's fertile ground, they'll take root and they'll start to grow. Now, angiosperms serve as food for humans, okay? And I said vegetable plants, they have flowers, and there's a lot of different fruit trees that have flowers. And before the fruit appears or the vegetables appear, the flowers are there. And then the flowers eventually fall off, and voila, you have apples, you have peaches, you have bananas, you have cucumbers, you have zucchini growing, okay? Now, when we're talking vegetables, we're talking food chain, okay, or the food pyramid. However, technically, they are the fruit of that plant, all right? So I don't know, like, if you eat peas, but if you ever take a pea pod, the pea pod is actually the fruit of that plant. And inside the pea pod are the peas, which are the seeds. So when you're eating peas, you're eating seeds of that plant, okay? Corn. Corn kernels are seeds. So the corn cob would be considered the fruit of that plant. And the corn kernels then would be the seeds. Now, even though, like I said, we consider them to be vegetables, that's because we're looking at the food pyramid. But they technically are the fruits of those particular plants. Angiosperms also are used in textiles, medicines, and for timber. And timber would be the wood that we use to make furniture and build houses and things like that. And here's a diagram of a typical angiosperm life cycle. You can see on the left-hand side of this diagram, you can see the internal structure of the flower. You have the stamen, which is composed of the anther and the filament. The stamen is the male organ of the flower, and the filament holds the anther up out of the flower because the anther is where pollen is made and stored. So if it's sticking up and out of the flower, it's easier for the insects and small animals and such to pick up the pollen and transfer it from flower to flower. Then you have the carpel, all right, also known as the pistil, which is pistil, and that is the stigma, the style, and the ovary. That is the female organ of the flower, and down inside the ovary is where you find the eggs. Okay, now we are going to look at this much deeper later on in our study of plants. However, on the right-hand side of this slide, you see the life cycle of an angiosperm. And you can see the pollen coming off the anther there, and if it lands on the stigma, part of the carpel or the pistil, it will grow a pollen tube and go down inside the ovary where it will fertilize the egg. And that fertilization of that egg creates the seed, which grows inside the ovary of that flower. And just like I said, but with apple trees and peach trees and all cherry blossoms, you see these beautiful flowers, but then the flowers disappear, and the next thing you know, you have these fruits appearing. And that's because it's the ovary of the flower that develops into the big fleshy fruit that we eat, or even the vegetables that we eat. All right, once the flower falls apart, then the ovary has nothing to do but grow. If the seed falls on fertile ground, you can see it will start to germinate, grow back into the flower, and the process starts all over again. All right? Now, specifically talking more so about angiosperms than gymnosperms, okay, but we will be talking about gymnosperms a little bit here and there also. We need to take a look at plant form and function, okay? If you guys remember from Bio 1, back when you were a freshman, you hopefully learned about the 5 levels of organization of living things. And that is cells, and a group of cells that work together to perform a particular function form tissues. A group of tissues that work together to perform a particular function form organs. Organs that work together to perform a particular function form organ systems, and then these organ systems all work together to form an organism. Okay? Well, not all 6 kingdoms of life follow all 5 levels of organization. All right, a lot of them only are the cellular level. Some of them are the cellular and tissue level. Some of them are cells, tissues, organs level. And then the animals really are the only organisms that follow all 5 levels of organizations: the cells, the tissues, the organ systems. And if you think of ourselves as humans, most intelligent organism in the animal kingdom, which I sometimes question, okay, we follow all 5 levels of those organization. Plants, on the other hand, only follow 4 of those levels. They have their plant cells, and their cells form tissues. Their tissues form organs, and then their organs form the plant organism itself. All right, so let's take a look then at the plant body. And we're going to start with the plant tissues. Now, there are 4 types of plant tissues that compose a plant's body. And the first one is the vascular tissue. And I said this is the tissue that enables plants to transport food and water throughout them. This is a plumbing system. If you think about our circulatory system as humans, okay, and as most animals have, that is our plumbing system, where we have materials being transported throughout the body via the blood. Well, the vascular tissue in plants is that plumbing system. It's not as intricate as our circulatory system would be, but it is how food and water is transported through the plant. And there's 2 types of vascular tissue. You have the xylem, which moves water and minerals up from the roots, and you have the phloem, which moves food with the sugars down from the leaves to the rest of the plant. Okay? So xylem moves water up, phloem moves food down. All right? Now, if you look at the different parts of a plant, the roots, the stems, and the leaves, and I'll give you a little hint, those are the 3 organs of plants. Okay, you can see the xylem and phloem and how they are arranged inside these different organs of a plant. In the root, okay, what we're looking at here are called cross sections, okay, of these organs. So in the root, you can see that the xylem takes up a whole lot more space than the phloem, okay, and that kind of makes sense. The xylem moves water and minerals up from the roots. So the roots are absorbing this, the food, the water and the minerals, and it's transporting the water up. All right, now in the stem, you can see that the xylem and phloem are pretty much equal. Okay, there's equal amounts of xylem and phloem, and in this particular stem, you can see that they're arranged in a circle around the center of the stem there, okay? But then in the leaf, you can see the veins of the leaf is actually what contains the vascular tissue, and these are called vascular bundles, all right? But notice it appears in this diagram that the phloem is a little bit larger than the xylem. And again, just like the xylem being larger in the root to take the water and the minerals up, it makes sense that the phloem is bigger in the leaves, because in the leaves is where photosynthesis happens. And so that's where all the sugars are being produced. And so the phloem is going to be a little bit bigger there in order to transport the sugars down through the rest of the plant. Now, the second type of tissue that you have is the ground tissue, and the ground tissue supports the vascular tissue. It's also used to store sugars, okay? The ground tissue would be like that gooey stuff. If you suppose you broke a flower stem and all that gooey stuff that's inside, that's the ground tissue, okay? Now, the ground tissue supports the vascular tissue throughout the entire body of the plant, through the roots, the stems, and the leaves. However, in the leaves, it has a particular function in that this is where the photosynthesis takes place. Not every leaf of a plant, or not every cell of a plant, excuse me, performs photosynthesis. Photosynthesis happens in leaves, and there are certain tissues on the inside of leaves, or certain cells, excuse me, on the inside of leaves, which is where photosynthesis occurs, and those cells are part of the ground tissue. Now here's a cross-section of a root where you can see the ground tissue. You can see, like, inside the center of the root you have the xylem and you have the phloem, but then the ground tissue is all that gooey stuff that's around it, okay? It is soft, it is usually kind of mushy, but it does provide good support for the vascular tissue as it moves up through the plant. Okay, the third type of plant tissue that you have is the dermal tissue, and this is the surface tissue. This is also called the epidermis, or it forms what's called the epidermis. Now, if you've ever heard of an epidermis before, an epidermis is an outer covering of an organism that protects everything that's inside. We as humans, as animals, have an epidermis, and it's called our skin. So the dermal tissue actually produces the skin of the plants. Okay, the plant body is covered with the epidermis, and again, it covers and it protects the entire plant. Now, in the first video, we talked about how plants are covered with this waxy substance called a cuticle, and that's that shiny stuff that makes it feel smooth. Well, it's the cells of the dermal tissue that produce the cuticle. So these cells secrete the waxy substance that covers the plant to prevent the water loss. And that's the cuticle. Okay, the fourth type of tissue that we have is called the meristem tissue, or meristematic tissue. And the meristem tissue is in charge of growth. The meristem tissue is found primarily in root tips, and stems. And if you remember when we were talking about germination in the first video, I said roots grow down and then stems grow up from the shoot. Okay? Well, you're going to find the meristem tissue at the very tips of roots, and you're going to find the meristem tissue at the base of the stem where the shoot is coming up out of the ground, because that's where the growth takes place. These cells continuously divide to form new cells. So these are the ones that are continuously performing mitosis to produce new cells to enable growth. Okay? All other tissues develop from the meristem tissue. So the dermal tissue, the ground tissue, the vascular tissue all grow from the meristem, and it makes sense because the meristem tissue controls growth. Okay? And again, the meristem tissue allows the plants to grow in length. The roots grow down, the stems grow up. All right? Now, at the tips of growing roots and stems, there's a special type of meristem tissue called the apical meristem. And that is found at the very tips of the roots and at the very base of the stem where it's coming up out of the ground. All right? Now, this enables the roots and the stems to grow in length. Here's a diagram of meristematic tissue, okay? And you can see in the root cap there, all right, the root tip, all right, where it's like kind of clear, that's where the meristem tissue is. And as the cells perform mitosis, they kind of push down. So that way the root continues to go down through the ground, all right? If you look at the shoot there on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see the apical meristem is right there where the base, or like the base of the stem, where it's coming up out of the ground. And those cells divide, pushing the stem up, all right? So in the meristem, the cells divide, pushing the root down, and in the stem, the cells divide, pushing the stems up. All right? Now, with that, okay, there are 3 plant organs that these four tissues combine to form. And the first one is your roots. And the roots have two specific jobs. They anchor the plant in the ground, and they absorb water and minerals. That's what they do. They hold the plant in the ground, and they absorb water and minerals. There's three types of root systems. You have your fibrous root system, which is the greatly branched root system. And if I asked you to draw me a picture of a plant with its roots, I guarantee you all of you would draw me this type of a root system, because this is primarily what you think of when you think of roots. But then there's also what's called a taproot system. And a taproot system is a single central root with many small roots extending off of it. But then you also have what's called adventitious roots, which are roots that grow from unusual places like stems and leaves. Okay, well, what does that mean, Mrs. Young? Well, here we have a diagram of the different types of root systems that you have. Okay, the first one that you see there is a taproot system, which is a single central root with many small roots extending off of it. It tells you there in that diagram that this is the root system of a dandelion. However, if you look at it, what does it look like? Most of you are probably sitting there thinking it looks like a carrot, and the answer is you're right. All right, a carrot is actually the root of a plant that we eat. All right, and it is a taproot. Another example of a taproot would be a turnip. I don't know if you guys have ever eaten a turnip. It's not long and thin like a carrot. It's actually kind of more like a bulb. It looks more like a bulb, but it is a taproot system. Now you can see all those root extensions that are coming off of that tap root. All right. The second picture there is your fibrous root system. And that would be the example, or that would be the type of root system that most of you would draw for me if I asked you to draw me a root. All right, or a root system, because that's what most people think of when they think of roots. Now, the third and the fourth pictures that you see there are examples of adventitious roots. All right, you see the corn there. Okay, and the corn, you can see it has its regular root system under the ground, but then above the ground, you can see that there's roots coming off the stem. All right, those are adventitious roots. Those are not normal roots. All right, those roots are there for a reason. Corn stalks are very tall, they're very thin, they're very flimsy, and a good stiff wind could either A, break them, or B, uproot them and carry them all over the place. Okay, so these adventitious roots there, those prop roots, they help to anchor the plant even more. It gives more stability to the corn plant. And that last one, the orchid there, those are aerial roots. Those are examples of roots that grow from leaves. They grow on the underside of leaves. Okay, other examples for that would be vines. That would be grapevines. Okay, sometimes the ivy plants. A lot of times you see those climbing vines growing on the sides of houses. All right, grapevines usually are, growing along lattice structures. You can walk underneath them and pull the grapes off of them as you're walking underneath them. Well, how they can do that is because they have these adventitious roots that grow from behind the leaves. And so it connects the leaves to kind of create like a ladder to enable for them to wrap around whatever it is that they're growing on. All right? Roots are the first, of course, to grow from seeds during germination. We've talked about that before. And all roots have a root cap, which is the very tip of the roots, and they cover and protect the tips of the roots. And then you have these tiny root hairs that grow above the root cap, and these root hairs look just like that. They look like hairs, and they extend everywhere from the roots through the soil. They're small, thin projections, and what they do is they increase the surface area of the roots. It increases the absorption. All absorption happens through these root hairs. So the more root hairs that a root has, the higher the absorption of water and minerals that they have. Now, the second organ of a plant is the stems. And the stems are the organ that contain the vascular tissue. They support, all the organs contain vascular tissue. However, the two main functions of the stems are that they support the leaves and they transport food and water. All right, just like the roots, they anchored the plant and they absorbed water and minerals. Stems support the leaves and they transport food and water. Now, just like with the roots, there are 3 stem types. The first is the herbaceous stems, and these are the soft stems that restrict the size of the plants. So these are like the soft, mushy types of stems. These are the stems that you would find with most flowers. Okay, these are stems of annual plants, which are plants that only grow once a year. The second type of stem that you have is the woody stem, and these are the strong, sturdy stems that allow plants to grow really tall. Well, you see wood in there, right? Well, these are the stems of trees. All right, so woody stems are the stems of the perennial plants, and these are plants that grow all year round, so trees, bushes, and things like that. But then you also have the modified stems, and these are stems that grow underground or parallel to the ground, and these store food. Now, if you remember back in the beginning of the school year when we were reviewing the macromolecules of life, and we were talking about carbohydrates, plants perform photosynthesis and they produce glucose. Well, glucose is a simple carbohydrate, it's a monosaccharide, and to store the glucose, animal cells will convert the glucose into glycogen, which is a polysaccharide, but plants will convert the glucose, into starch, and it's stored as starch. Well, think about some plant products that you eat that are very high in starch. One is a potato. A potato is a modified stem. It grows under the ground. If you've ever had potatoes in your house and they've been there for a while and you start to see these white projections coming off of them, we call them the eyes of the potato. Those are actually roots that are starting to grow out from that stem. All right, the same thing with onions. Onions are a modified stem. And if you've ever had onions in your house for a long period of time, and you go into the bag to grab one, you see these white things coming off one end of the onion, and you see these green things coming off the other end of the onion. Those are roots and leaves growing out of that stem. So an onion is a stem of a plant that grows under the ground. Other examples of modified stems are strawberries. Strawberry plants they have stems, they're called runners. Okay? And what that means is, here's some examples, first of all, of the 3 different types of stems. You can see the herbaceous and the woody stems there in the upper left-hand corner of this slide. And you can see the potato and the bulbs, which the bulb looks like an onion, okay, in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. But in the lower end of this slide, especially the lower left-hand side, you can see the strawberry plants, and those are runners. And what that means is you have a plant that grows up out of the ground. The roots are in the ground, stem grows up, and there's leaves on top. But then the stem extends parallel to the ground, will drop, and it will form more roots. And then another stem grows up with more leaves. And then the stem extends again, parallel, drops down, forms roots, etc. And this keeps going. So strawberry plants will cover an entire field in this fashion, and really they're all part of each other because they all started as one plant and these runners came off from them. All right. Okay, then the last plant organ that we're going to look at, and we're going to go into a whole lot more detail about these in the next video for next week, and that is the leaves. And leaves are extremely important for plants because in the leaves is where photosynthesis occurs. These cells, the cells of leaves, contain many chloroplasts, and leaves are thin and flat to allow for maximum absorption of light. Okay? But photosynthesis occurs in the leaves of all plants. And I know we talked about it earlier in the year when we were reviewing plant cells. Okay, but in the winter time, when leaves of trees are not there, they fall off, and you think like the trees are dead. They're really not dead. They're surviving off of all of the glucose that was produced during the spring, the summer, and the early fall before they started to change colors and fall off. They survive off of all of that glucose that has been stockpiled through the body of that plant. All right, so then when the leaves come back out in the spring again, Photosynthesis occurs a lot, especially with the extended daylight hours. And again, once again, the glucose gets stockpiled through the plant. Okay, now there's three main parts of the plant that I want you to be able to identify. On the lower right hand corner of this slide, you see a diagram of a leaf, and you can see that there's a couple of structures that I whited out that I don't feel it's important for you to know at this point in time. However, there are three parts of a leaf that I do want you to be aware of, and that is the blade, which is the large flat portion of the leaf, the petiole, which is the stem-like structure that attaches the leaf to the stem, and then the node, where the leaf is attached to the stem. So usually the node is a little extension of the stem, kind of sort of where the leaf grows from, and when you pull the leaf off of a stem, the node is usually sometimes attached to the leaf, there the petiole, sometimes it's left on the stem, okay? But you can see in this diagram that the veins are also labeled through the blade of the leaf. And remember, that's the vascular tissue. Those are the vascular bundles of xylem and phloem as it's moving through the leaf. All right? Okay, well, I hope this makes sense to you guys. And let's just recap a little bit some of the stuff we talked about today. There are two types of seeded vascular plants, and those are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Gymnosperms are the cone-bearing plants, angiosperms are the flowering plants. All right, there are four types of plant tissues that compose the body of the plant. That is the vascular, the dermal, the ground, and the meristem tissue. And then there are three main organs of all plants, and those are the roots, the stems, and the leaves. Okay, now we are going to do a much more detailed study of the leaves next week when we come back for video number 3. All right, and we're also going to look at more detail as far as the flowers are concerned, after we talk about the leaves. But for now, all right, hopefully you guys understand everything. Feel free to email me at any time. I'll be more than happy to answer some questions for you, and I'll see you in the next video.